We've got some difficult days ahead. That's what he said. We've got some difficult days ahead. That fateful night when he seemed he knew he might be dead the next morning, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." That fateful night, after so many battles had been won, he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." A curious choice of words, no matter how you look at it. If you say, like so many do, that on this night his speech was a prophecy of his own death, it's a very curious choice of words because he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." We've got, not you've got, not y'all got, we've got. A curious choice of words if you say he was looking at how far we still had yet to go. It's curious, given all the new legislation at our disposal that included at that time the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and even an executive order on affirmative action. With all that at the ready and being enforced like never before, he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." Curious choice of words. If you don't already know, do understand that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. always chose his words carefully. And no, I don't mean that he was careful not to hurt anyone's feelings. I mean that to him, each word was a part of a cadence, a part of a voice sonata. Each word and phrase was part of a speaking symphony. No wonder then that we heard eloquence like, "Say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness." No wonder then that we heard phrases like, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Dr. King always chose his words carefully. And that's why I'm certain that his choice of words in Memphis was not an accident. He meant to say, "We've got some difficult days ahead." But what was he thinking? And what did he already know? It was clear that he knew. Somehow, he already knew. Maybe he knew and wanted to tell us that integration was not the whole answer. Maybe he knew too and would tell us today that integration wasn't the whole problem. Maybe he just knew that a new freedom would bring new problems. Maybe he just knew that an old-style, watchful community could become a new-style, don't-see-nothing community. Maybe he just knew that an old-style parenting community might become a new-style, that's not my child community. And maybe he just knew that vigilance might give way to complacency. Maybe he just knew that righteousness might give way to self-righteous inaction. Maybe he just knew that caution might give way to arrogance. Maybe he just knew that group cohesion could give way to unbridled individualism. Maybe he just knew that group politics might give way to party politics. Maybe because he knew these things, he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." By the way, he didn't say in the way it would have likely been said in 1968 that the Negro had some difficult days ahead. He said, "We've got." You must understand, Reverend King was a smart man. And sure, on that night, in April in 1968, his audience at the Mason Temple in Memphis was mostly black. But Dr. King knew that the cameras were rolling. He had realized long before that night that he had become a moral voice for America. He knew this because of the amount of hate that was directed at him. Why pay such attention or waste energy on him? Because his words, his cadences, his moral message was getting through to others. His moral authority was powerful, and it was growing. So no doubt he was speaking to us all, every man, woman, non-binary folks, and every child of every race. He was speaking to all of us when he said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." Behind those words, I hear an exhortation to get ready. And now today, we live in those difficult days. I find it odd, myself, that even as we're nearly a quarter way through a new millennium, we continue to blame the difficulties around us on ignorance. We are still saying that people don't know any better, and yet I wonder. I wonder if it really was ignorance that led two men to kidnap a young gay man, tie him to a fence, beat him with a pistol until his skull collapsed. I wonder if it was ignorance that led a gunman to shoot and kill 8 people, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent, in 3 Asian businesses in Atlanta. I wonder if it was ignorance when a gunman who was targeting Latinx residents shopping at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, shot and killed 22 people and injured dozens more. I wonder if it was ignorance when a Minneapolis police officer charged with protecting our life and our safety knelt on the neck of George Floyd in Minneapolis for a little over 9 minutes, killing him. I wonder. These are not acts of ignorance, but acts of hate. And acts of this sort are not prevented by education alone. More information is not the only answer, because the source of the problem is in the examples we allow to strive in our communities. The answer is in different examples in our communities. The answer is in different communities. Communities of zero tolerance, where racial jokes are never neutral, they are divisive. Gay jokes are never neutral, they are divisive. Blonde jokes are never neutral, they are divisive. When you look at the pictures of the men who did these acts of evil that I have mentioned, you might notice a glazed look on their faces. Glazed, coming to reality looks. It's as if they're coming out of a hypnotic trance, and in fact, they were. They had been hypnotized by the community's tolerance for hostility. It had been all around them, a deep tolerance towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color, tolerance for deep hostility towards gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and queer people, deep hostility towards women, deep hostility towards immigrants. It was this tolerance that allowed them to think, for just long enough, that what they were doing was right. Only when these men heard the community's uproar after the fact did they begin to come to understand the reality of how the community had betrayed them through misguided tolerance. In one of my favorite movies, The Lion King, we learn about the circle of life from the great leader Mufasa, who teaches his son, Simba. One of the lessons Mufasa teaches Simba is that the great leaders of the past watch us to see how we are doing. And if we are smart, we will try to follow their examples of good work. You see, our great leaders are part of that circle of life, and we keep them in the circle of life by remembering them. Surely the best way for us to remember them is through our behavior and trying to continue the good work that they started. In the story of the Lion King, the great Mufasa is killed. And later in spirit, Mufasa comes back to remind his son Simba of that lesson. Mufasa tells Simba, remember. We've got some difficult days ahead. That's what he said. And it's still true. Ahead of us will lie some difficult days. That's all right if we remember that it's not simply enough to attend breakfast celebrations for Dr. King. It's not even enough for Episcopalians to be satisfied being Episcopalian. We must reach beyond ourselves, individually and institutionally, all of us. It's not enough for me to be satisfied with whatever I think I've achieved. It's not enough for us to be satisfied with how far we think we have come since our beginnings. That kind of self-satisfaction is what Dr. King warned us against when he said, we've got some difficult days ahead. So yes, there are still more difficult days to come, but we will persevere when we remember. And reflecting on the poet Robert Frost, remember that the woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but we have promises to keep, and miles to go before we sleep, and miles to go before we sleep. Remember those promises to keep. Remember, we've got difficult days ahead, and remember, in the circle of life, we are all tied to each other.